Hello and welcome to Business Talk, brought to you by the Sharonville Chamber of Commerce. I'm Britt Scarce with Emory Federal Credit Union. I'm your host. Today here in studio we have Karl Ulrich, who is with Sebaly, Shillito Dyer, here to talk to us about employee poaching. Karl?
Hey, Britt.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So can an employer go and steal another employer's employees? Is that okay?
Well, okay is a loaded question, but it happens all the time.
Yeah.
It's a competitive environment, right?
Especially right now. I mean, we have a 3.5% unemployment rate, and we have more jobs than we have people.
Yeah, employment's as low as it's been in decades, and there's a lot of competition out there for high-level skilled talent, and so you try to recruit the best talent, and a lot of times those people already have jobs, and sometimes they have jobs with competitors, and sometimes they have jobs with people, with companies or with employers with whom your intending employer will deal from time to time. So there's a lot of that kind of thing going on. So the short answer to your question, if there is one, is it does happen, and it's okay if certain things are, checked first, and there are always some limitations, always some factors you need to consider when you're recruiting high-level talent. There's a risk to that, particularly if they are, bound up with restrictions from their prior employer, non-competes, non-solicitations, those kinds of things. So there may be contractual restrictions. What
about intellectual property?
Exactly. There may be limits to the extent they have the ability to, pick up and leave their employment. They may have knowledge of certain secrets. They may have access to, very valuable formulas or designs or strategic plans, things that make that employer more competitive, give them a competitive edge. Those are the kinds of secrets that have value to that employer, and when they leave, if they have some of that stuff in a computer or in a laptop or in a briefcase or even in their heads, those secrets go with them, and that's a risk. And so it's not just a risk for the employer they're leaving, but it can also be a risk for the employer that's hiring them, because if they're coming on board with all that information.
Isn't the employee also at risk? I mean, if they think, well, I can download my contacts, my information from my computer and take that with me, right? Well, there's probably some stuff in there that they're probably not allowed to take.
There's no question. It is first and foremost a risk for the departing employee. So they really need to understand their rights and obligations leaving an employer. I mean, what we're really talking about here, Brett, I think are employees for the most part who, I would classify them in three areas really. The salespeople, and why are they particularly at risk, or why would they be a risk, is because they have knowledge of employment of sales relationships. They know the customers.
I'm a salesperson, and if I take all my clients over to this other company, we're going to move them all over. Well, I mean, that's, obviously it could be a huge financial loss to the company they left.
Well, and they know, for example, how much they're selling. The employer's selling products, what the margins are. Where the break-even point is. That information.
They know how to beat them.
They know how to beat them. They know what the strengths and the weaknesses of the products are. Right? Yeah. So that information and the sales relationships, certainly. So those salespeople are the kinds of folks you have to consider restrictions on. The other area would be the research people, the idea people, the designers, the folks who have the product ideas, who are doing the research and development piece of the production, the ones who are developing the schematics, or who are doing the formulations, or who are coming up with the new ideas for the next best product. Those are the people who have the intellectual know-how and have the technical skills, and who are knowing, if they pick up and leave, they know what the former employer's next best product idea is going to be. They can go to a competitor and say, well, guess what, XYZ Corporation is developing this idea. You can beat them to the market if you start working on it now. And here are some of the ideas that we were tossing around back at the old place. So those research and development, those design people, technical people, software engineers, those are the folks who carry with them the technical knowledge, the product ideas. And then the third group that we are most concerned about are the executive level people, the people who have knowledge of the business generally, who have knowledge of the company finances, who have been involved in designing, or who are knowledgeable about the strategic plans for the company. And that's not just product information. That's broader strategy, business strategies. Those people also represent a level of knowledge and skill that is important to the employer, and which, if lost and put in the hands of a competitor, those people would be extremely valuable to a competitor. So anytime anytime you're losing somebody like that, or you are planning on hiring somebody that falls into one or more of those categories, you have certain considerations that you have to take into account before you do the hiring. And certainly, if you've got them in your workforce, you want to take some precautions to protect the company, but also to advise them of what their individual rights and obligations will be going forward.
So if I'm a company that's hiring people and paying them $25,000, $30,000, their production line type people, would you end up with doing a non-compete for all employees, no matter whether they're the janitor or the VP, or do you just do above certain income levels or certain titles?
I don't know that there's an income cutoff necessarily. There can be. I think it's fair to say that the folks who are least compensated in an organization, who are doing the more laborer type tasks, the less specialized work, they tend not to be as readily tied up with non-compete agreements or non-solicitation or confidentiality agreements, because they just don't have access to the kind of information or the kind of knowledge necessarily that would be a threat if they picked up and went to another employer. And what we see in courts is that when non-compete agreements or other restrictions are being litigated, they're less likely to be enforced where you have employees who are at the have more generalized knowledge, they don't fall into those three categories we talked about. They're the less compensated individuals, and they don't have the specialized knowledge that would be a significant competitive threat.
So would the non-compete be for a specific region or geographic area, like say within 50 miles of the employer, or would they cover the entire United States, or does it just depend?
Yeah, it's going to depend on the employer that's setting up those restrictions. Ordinarily, we talk about restrictions as being only as broad as necessary to protect the legitimate business interests of the employer. So whatever that is. And so a big company might be a broader non-compete. A smaller company probably a smaller.
Can an employer prevent an employee from being able to secure gainful employment? I mean, if you're preventing them from being able to be employed, where's that line drawn?
Well, again, the restrictions are only enforceable so long as they're protecting legitimate business interests. If you've got let's say a chief financial officer of a major corporation who has knowledge and access to all the sensitive financial information of a company, that restriction would be probably enforceable as to any other employment that might involve being a chief financial officer, or might involve the same type of industry. Now, if he or she were to go to a completely different industry that doesn't compete with his or her former employer, completely different industry, or in an area that the former employer doesn't have a presence or have a market, you're not going to be able to enforce the non-compete or the restriction beyond certain parameters in that sense. But it's a complicated question, but most of the time you're not going to be prevented from making a living in other non-competitive areas or in other industries or in other markets. Those things, that would make a restrictive covenant overbroad and probably unenforceable in the courts.
Now, if you don't have non-competes and somebody kind of poaches away your top sales person, is there anything what can an employer do? I mean, is there recourse that can be taken if there is no situation where there's a non-compete in place?
Well, there are always restrictions on intellectual property. So there are certain statutes in place, both at the federal and state level, that protect companies and employers' trade secrets, for example. And those restrictions, those protections exist whether or not there's a contract in place between the employer and the employee. So there would be some remedies there. But we think of the restrictions for an employer to be, they really all kind of work hand in hand. I think a non-compete is part of the puzzle. The non-solicitation is another part of the puzzle. Confidentiality is part of the puzzle. There are a number of things you want to have in an agreement because you want to supplement what is in the statute. You want to create a comprehensive protection of the legitimate business interests. And then that's the best strategy. So you don't want to just rely on what's in the statute. The other thing I'll say is that when you are hiring somebody away who may have restrictions from a former employer, you also have risk, because if you're not, the employee certainly has risk, but the employer hiring that individual has risk because they could be involved in misappropriating the trade secrets that employee brings along. So there are certain collateral liability risks. Honestly, it's really not in a hiring employer's best interest necessarily to hire somebody who has private secret information. I know it happens all the time, but the companies that really protect that stuff are going to go after the hiring employer. They're going to go after them for damages. They're going to go after them for
and do they win a lot of times?
Very often.
Okay.
Very often. So the employer hiring away just because they don't have a contract or a restriction with that other company doesn't mean that they wouldn't also have some liability risk there as well. So that's to keep in mind. I think one of the things I talk to hiring employers about is when you're hiring somebody away who falls in one of those three categories, who may potentially have information that is sensitive or carry with them some sensitive information. Before you even hire them on board, bring them on board, you want to make sure that they've told you what restrictions, if any, that they have, and you make the offer of employment contingent upon not having a non-compete, not having restrictions that would interfere with your employment.
Wow. Great information. Obviously people need to be very careful with this, and I think a lot of folks don't even give it a second thought until the situation comes up.
Right.
And so great information, Karl. You've been watching Business Talk. Our guest is Karl Ulrich with Sebaly, Shillito Dyer. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Business Talk.